It depends a lot on the details of the jet stream. In fact, at the same time as the warm in Western Europe, we've had extreme cold in Russia, you see. So their crops didn't do well at all.
Adapt 2030 Mini Ice Age Conversations covers changes in our climate due to a new and intensifying grand solar minimum. In the media, overlooking, downplaying, or burying cold weather changes occurring on our planet. This is in order to keep the global warming agenda steaming full speed ahead. I do this podcast and radio program because we need to begin conversations on how to adapt our food growing strategies long before 2030 as agricultural zones shift, affecting global crop output, but very few mainstream media outlets are talking about the most important issue of our time: cold weather crop losses. Our sun is going through a 400-year cycle, which has effects on our weather patterns as our magnetosphere weakens and the jet streams go out of flow. It's not CO2, it's not you, it's the sun. Are you ready to thrive in the grand solar minimum? Then join me for Mini Ice Age Conversations. I'm your host, David Dubine. Good afternoon, everyone. Today I have with me Piers Corbin, astrophysicist of Weather Action Long Range Forecasters.
One is the question about the strength of solar cycle 25, right? We're now in solar cycle 24. It's dropping fast and it's below the sunspot numbers are below all the predictions from various models, which are sort of look-back models at what's happened last time there was a similar cycle and so forth. It's below those, which is interesting. Now, the predictions on solar cycle 25 coming from Russians who look at the rates of change of magnetic fields on the sun prior to any cycle. Their view is very interesting, that the solar cycle 25 might not be super weak. Might not be super weak, but might be similar to or possibly more active than solar cycle 24, which means that the super cold we're expecting might be coming early rather than waiting till 2035. It might be 2030 or 2025. I don't know. We're thinking about that. However, I would say that these models the Russians used, and this comes from a man called Kirill Kuzinian, but there's a group of them. Those models are, of course, based on what they know for the last few cycles. So they don't have, of course, real data on what happened at the last Maunder minimum or Volta minimum. They don't have data of what was in details of what was happening on the sun then. So these projections, I think you have to take them carefully, are projections, but nevertheless it's interesting what they said at this point. Let's see if they change their idea in a year's time, of course, which could well be the case, because they do come up with modifications of this stuff every year.
Yeah, and that's the thing about the governments of the world, at least should be comparing. Okay, the IPCC has one set of data and they have one idea theory that they want to put out. That's great. But what about this whole other set of data that you're talking about? And one person, I'm not familiar with that data set, but I'm familiar with Dr. Abutumatov and Zarkova and that whole crew over there too, Popov, Shepard, and Zarkov. But I mean, they have a whole set of information as well, and there's so many other people out there, John Casey and yourself, and everybody coming out saying, hey, there's this whole other set of things based on the sun. Now, why is this so not being compared together? My whole estimation is if we have two sets of data, we need to start getting at least ready for changes that are coming. And if we could get more of a heads up on, hey, so maybe some of these are electromagnetic changes, and something that happened hundreds of years ago could give us a blueprint for what's going to happen in the future. I just still keep asking myself, why is it always directed at CO2? And even with the cold changes, they're still pushing us back to the heat.
The basics of academia are now corrupted by this, what Eisenhower warned of as the military-industrial complex, but in detailed terms, it's funding for the promotion of a delusion. And there's loads of people on board. I've talked to some of them and I've said explicitly in meetings, you're talking nonsense. You see, the way the Royal Society in Britain works is that it's got experts in various fields in it who are proven experts, but their general way of being is not to criticise any other experts, so they pat each other on the back. Now, in there, I'm sure quite a few of them can see that the man-made climate change stuff is complete drivel. So generally speaking, they don't voice anything about it. Now, there have been some scientists in the Royal Society, to be fair, recently, who have raised objections. But it's pretty slow coming, pretty weak. We think the whole of the way that academia operates has to change. For example, you've got to end this peer review process, which I would call PAL review process, where it's mates meeting behind closed doors and agreeing, if they like a set of theories, they repeat them, and if they don't like them, they downgrade them. Some stuff gets through, that is for sure. More and more of the realist stuff is getting through and getting published. But, of course, even then, it doesn't get the attention of the mainstream media or new scientist, which is completely the opposite of anything new. It just defends the status quo. So in most sciences, and this applies in astrophysics as well as in climate science, the way it operates is the different groups who develop things are busy defending their own ideas as opposed to developing new ideas. And, we have this concept of the consensus. And if something's reached a consensus, it must be the proof of it. But this is complete nonsense. Consensus in the history of science has never advanced science, never. Science advances by the breaking of consensus. So this idea of consensus rule is a way of regimenting people ideologically and regimenting science. And actually it's a limitation on the development of science, and it has to be pulled down. We talked about this at Electric Universe and various conferences, including, we're going to talk about it more in Porto. There's another big conference happening around the 8th and 9th, I think, that weekend, with climate realists in it. We want to set up a alternative academy which will do peer review in a completely open way, i.e. it'll be absolutely public. It'll have proper scientists doing peer review, reading and commenting, but what they decide and say will be public and publishable and happen in public, so that you won't have this PAL review stuff. And we would entertain the publication of hitherto things which have had difficulty getting an airing elsewhere. I think we have to make science accountable. And, of course, politics has to be accountable. And this is different from saying there's left and right and all that, because all sorts of people parade themselves as one or the other for whatever reasons. But the key divisions, I think, in the political world now are those who support accountability and those who go along with the rule by the super corporate interests who have a completely profit-orientated view, and the man-made climate change theory is a gravy train.
You can see this consensus kind of mindset through every facet of society. And it's not just exclusively onto the sciences, but so Piers, let me throw this idea at you here. So the amount of peer-reviewed research that has been, put through the pipes and put through the system so far, they always talk about in the IPCC all the, consensus, etc. But how many of those papers were never accepted for review, just purely dismissed because it went against the status quo?
It's actually scientifically corrupt. First of all, it's not scientists. They've got a few token scientists who do what they're told. It's government appointees. The IPCC is government appointees. So they're not scientists, or some of them might have a science degree, but whether they practice science or anything is another matter. They are appointed by governments to carry out government's interests. The scientists are there to produce something, and then the IPCC issues summaries, which are not the same as what the scientists produce. They issue summaries to alarm people. And that is how it goes, and that is corrupt, and we have to take that down. But in the process, of course, when they issue scientific papers, the IPCC is not subject to any peer review from outside, i.e. they don't go to Nature and say, will you agree this, will you publish this? I mean, I dare say Nature would say yes or no, so 3 bags also, but they don't even do that. They publish things and produce them internally and announce this is IPCC approved. Well, some of their stuff was just something they'd read in newspapers and talked about the glaciers shrinking, glaciers growing, shrinking, of course, but when it wasn't true. They just used exaggerated reports in newspapers and turned them into fact in the IPCC, and then they became truth, It's a bit like in a court of law, swearing an affidavit. So whatever you say becomes true, and that is it. We have to have actual objective science, and the IPCC is doing away with that. In my opinion, the IPCC should be completely closed down. So Donald Trump, withdrawing from the Paris Accords is a great step forward. I mean, whatever you might think about any other policy for or against what Donald Trump does, what he's done about climate change is a step forward for science.
Yeah, so you're talking about the glaciers there. Yeah. They use the glaciers a lot to prove or, kind of push their agenda forward. Now, these ice shelves that are cracking off down in Antarctica, you talked about West Antarctica down there, all the underwater volcanoes that are starting to erupt around the planet, as well as above ground volcanoes that we're seeing. So what do you feel marching into the future with the grand solar minimum intensifying, and you yourself stating and understanding that there's a connection between solar activity and volcanic eruptions? I know I've had a couple of people ask me this question. So what do you feel with the volcanic uptick? Will there be one? Will it stay stable?
You see, those who haven't looked at data properly attribute the cold to the increased soot or something for volcanoes, but actually that isn't true. The increased volcanoes will make soot, which will cause a cooling, yes, but the cooling has already started when the volcanoes start coming. So probably the effect of volcanic ash in terms of cooling is probably being doubled from what it really is. Now, people might wonder, well, how can this happen? Low solar activity making more earthquakes and volcanoes. And the way we look at it is that the tectonic plates are trying to move all the time. An earthquake is something waiting to happen. And an earthquake will, if you don't have much hits onto the Earth through geomagnetic activity, which can do a little shaking up, then you won't get earthquakes. It's a bit like having a bag of sugar and you tip the sugar out, say. Well, if you don't tap the bag with sugar, then it will come out in a plop. It'll just come out a big lump, you see. If you tap the bag of sugar, then it will come out as a stream, right? And you won't get any big lumps. So, if you like, tectonic plates are things trying to happen, and if you've got reasonably high solar activity, the geomagnetic activity resulting will be like a series of taps and give you small earthquakes, and the plates will move. But if you don't have much of that and don't have tap, then the plates will build up stress, and then when there is a hit from the solar wind, because there will be some bigger ones at times, it will go whack, and you'll get a big earthquake. And we've had more giant earthquakes. And when you have big earthquakes, the relative motion of the plates causes vast amounts of heat and volcanism, and that gives you the volcanic activity. So the periods of solar minimum are actually low solar activity, which is going to be less taps, and when you have occasional action in them, that will give you the extra earthquakes and the increased volcanism. And that's what you see, and it will happen through the generally low but not completely zero period of solar activity.
It brings me to my next question. Here's from somebody else who wrote in and said, cosmic rays, do they indeed create more cloud cover with the magnetosphere weakening? More galactic cosmic rays are coming in. That's a known science fact. Great. The increase in galactic cosmic rays is directly related to the solar output.
It's a completely confused concept, and I would avoid it completely because it mixes up radiation and particles, which are different and have different effects. The cosmic rays are a proxy, an inverse proxy for solar activity. When there's high solar activity, you get less cosmic rays. These are galactic cosmic rays coming from outside the solar system, certainly. And they reduce because the general sun's magnetic field excludes them. And that is a pretty straightforward thing. However, it's another thing to empower the cosmic rays themselves with something significant. Because you see, when a wind blows, you see that trees thrash around. Well, if you didn't know anything, you might think that the trees thrashing around were causing wind. I mean, they do correlate very well, so if you knew nothing, you would conclude that. And unfortunately, this stuff about the causative effects of cosmic rays is not entirely untrue, but largely untrue in the way it's talked about. Because the sun itself is emitting particles all the time. The cosmic rays, although they're much higher energy, they will not interact with anything, or not. They very rarely interact when they're high energy. They just go through things, and they have to be slowed down to interact, and this is just a general fact of cloud chamber physics and so forth. So the issue then is the total energy of the galactic cosmic rays and the total energy of particles coming from the sun. And the particles coming from the sun have a total energy 300 times that of the galactic cosmic rays. So they're not going to have much effect. So basically, the 99.7% of solar effect, of particle effect, is from the sun, not from cosmic rays. Now, if the cosmic rays were the key arbiter and connector between the sun and the earth, then world temperatures will have to follow an 11-year cycle, because the cosmic rays are going to go up with 11 years, which is the same as the amount of solar activity goes up 11 years. Cosmic rays go up 11 years and they modulate everything in an 11-year cycle. However, the main signal in world temperatures is not 11 years, it's 22 years, showing that the key thing is the magnetic connectivity, the actual direction of the field between the sun and the earth. Therefore, the 11-year temperature cycle is much lower. It's suppressed. There is something there, and there is a rainfall cycle of 11 years too. So it means the cosmic rays in their effect on the weather are overstated. Cosmic rays do have other effects. The high-energy ones, which manage to avoid getting collided with anything in the atmosphere, they can reach lower levels and cause genetic damage. So probably the general effect of cosmic rays and low solar activity is increasing the rate of modification of species and genetic damage in cells' bodies, which can speed up evolution, interestingly. I don't mean you're going to see sudden increase of headless chickens or something, apart from politicians, that is, running around during the Maunder minimum. I think those are the things you've got to understand about cosmic rays, and not label them with powers when really their main use is a proxy for solar activity. And they will be doing things to clouds, that is true, but it's going to be small compared with what solar activity is doing to clouds. And it's also not easy to understand, because there's many different levels at which clouds are affected by particles from the sun. So the whole thing is not as simple as we've been told.
So what would happen with the canceling magnetic waves on the sun? That would definitely have an effect on our Earth here, because you're talking about, forget the cosmic rays, you're talking about when magnetic fields are canceling on the sun, and also in different layers within the sun.
Just as I said, they're 1/300th of the total particle flux. We have to understand the details, as well as the wider picture. I mean, there's lots of people who do things who think, yeah, this idea is it. Well, one particular idea. If I had been told 5 years ago, oh yeah, the oceans are all moving around because of magnetic fields, I would have thought, well, okay, maybe not. You know what I mean? But now I can see this is quite likely the main driver.
Yeah, that's interesting. So this is a personal question from me, just thinking about that. Okay, we're talking about magnetic fields and Birkeland currents, but these Birkeland currents are going star to star, other galaxies, and other solar systems close to us. We look out in telescopes and see a sun has decreased in its output state, and know that Birkeland currents connected, because we see these string of pearls, if you will, in the galactic formations.
The lesson from that is that the standard models of the universe involving essentially gravity forming galaxies are really just don't work. I mean, it's very difficult to form these strings of things in such a greatly structured manner, and these hyper-structured, nebulae structures, galaxy structures, or star cluster structures. I mean, loads of them. And you look at it, you can see electrical activity everywhere. A lot of this stuff is not observed because telescopes are not pointing that way. I mean, we want to observe Birkeland currents by some means or other, as opposed to thinking about what they must be. Now, NASA has mentioned what they call magnetic ropes and so on, sort of observed or found in the solar wind, but most of the satellites like to be in geostationary orbits where they're dealing with communication rather than flying over the polar regions, you see. So you will need a lot more polar region satellites and things directly related to studying what is coming out of the sun and where it goes, and the details of what happens in the solar wind. But this is difficult stuff, and requires quite likely new ways of probing into the solar wind. But I would look forward to this. And NASA, of course, has a public face where they're busy trying to carry on funding by repeating the climate change nonsense. But that will limit what they can do on other things, because if they start announcing all sorts of discoveries which are completely nothing to do with man-made climate change, then they could be in trouble. Now, with Trump in charge, maybe there won't be, and maybe we'll see, NASA coming up with the truth more often. But as it is, they are still seem to be hidebound towards this because there's a big inertia in the bureaucracy. But I look forward to NASA and NOAA actually forging ahead on new frontiers of science, because the European science is completely held back by the man-made climate change impositions upon them. This isn't like a very expensive type of project either. I mean, it's not like sending people into space, which is the expense running this project is actually pretty small compared with, well, everything the military does anyway. It's not an issue of money that's holding it back, it's an issue of ideology.
Because if you're going to try to tell mom and pop on Main Street in America, hey, by the way, we replicated all the plasma experiments and the petroglyphs.
There's a whole lot of other things happening which are not readily explicable by the standard erosional stuff. But once you get the idea that electricity, see, Maxwell's equations work on any scale, right? So they work on the size of an atom, or even a nucleus, although they have quantum mechanical problems around there, but certainly the size of an atom, Maxwell's equations hold. And they also hold in the size of a lab, or the size of this planet, or the size of the nearest star, the sun, or the size of the galaxy. So, we could have, where you can talk fairly well about microamps, we can also talk realistically about what can be done by billions and trillions and trillions and trillions of amps, hitting a core of a galaxy and so on, and that is, completely amazing, But that is how we have to think.
Yeah, it's almost as if we sit here and we're back in the 14th century and we understand that the sun is actually the center of the solar system, and everybody else has been taught that the Earth is the center and everything else revolves around it. I mean, there was all this debate going on back then too, but it just didn't reach because there was really no mainstream back then. But it's that same kind of, there's this whole other set of science that's not being discussed, as well as to the drivers of everything else, because if the electromagnetism is the main driver and the main constructor of everything that is, well, then that's a whole different ballgame. Then it's all just gravity.
Fluid flow, fluid dynamics and the like, which leaves out electricity. To get these vast rotations is just extremely difficult. Basically, tornadoes should be very rare events. I don't know, but standard meteorology has got severe limitations, as has astrophysics got severe limitations. And both of these limitations, it seems to me, can be overcome with a better electrical application involving electric and magnetic interacting fields and charged particles moving around. These are much more powerful than gravity. Now, gravity has a definite role, that is absolutely true, and gravity may indeed be some sort of side effect of electromagnetism, actually. That's my view anyway. But it is an easy thing to do, to work things out with gravity, but the gravity is insufficient and the standard terms of in standard equations of fluid mechanics are also insufficient to explain meteorological formations in the main.
Let me leave you with a thought here on limitation. Over in Newfoundland, as they call it, over in Canada, there was a meteorologist over there named Eddie Shear, and it snowed during what was technically summer, because when it reaches that certain day, it's technically summer. So it snowed 3 or 4 days into what's considered summer. So under his training from the IPCC into the how to explain global warming to the masses as a meteorologist, he called the snow, the record snow, by the way, record depth snow in summer, because there couldn't be snow in summer. So he relabeled it as white rain. So that's my last thought. Piers, thank you so much for your conversation tonight. And after that point, Piers and I were cut off. There were many more interesting ideas about the forecast going out in the grand solar minimum, as well as the lunar solar relationship. But just an example from this point in our interview, when it got incredibly interesting about the future that will affect your lives, this is what we experienced.
Half the 18.6. I wonder.
And that interference went on for 20 minutes. And what I consider the most important part of the interview, the intensification of the grand solar minimum when it got coldest, and what we can expect with the weather moving forward affecting Europe, United States, Asia, and everywhere else that crops are grown across this planet. I firmly believe that was definite interference in our call. Thanks for listening, though. I'll have Piers back on once again. WeatherAction.com is where you can find him and sign up for the reports. And Adapt 2030 is my YouTube channel where I'm going to be posting these types of interviews as well as many Ice Age Conversations podcasts, anywhere you can find a podcast hosted on the net. Thanks so much, and I'll see you next time.